Now, many comic historians and experts say that this is the beginning point of the Silver Age. I would say myself that the Silver Age was developing, but this is a high moment in the Silver Age. It is the first appearance of Barry Allen, the Flash. It is a completely different character from Jay Garrick. New guy, new origin. His powers are derived from a freak accident in a police chemistry lab. Barry Allen was always known to be a police chemist. These days we would call him a CSI, crime scene investigator, but that's not a term that we used in the 1950s. Barry Allen as the Flash led the way for other superheroes to come back in a much greater popularity. Perhaps not to the same degree that they were during the war days, but certainly they were popular in a way that they hadn't been for almost a decade. 1956 gave us the Flash, and a little bit later we would see Green Lantern. This would be Hal Jordan, the leading character of the Green Lantern Corps, with the Little Blue Men, the Guardians of the Universe, and the Corps, the alien space cop corps that was the Green Lantern Corps. Much, much higher concepts coming out of this. National periodicals, which had absorbed other comic companies, other defunct comic companies, would either blend these characters in, or they would sit on them in inventory until such time as they could bring them out into features of their own. On the other side of the avenue, Timely Comics has pretty much become Atlas Comics, and Atlas Comics sees that, hey, superheroes are popular again. Now, we had already seen stories involving Sid Shores and Jack Kirby and Joe Simon, and yes, Stan Lee began his writing career at Timely Comics in the 1940s. Stan Lee was still employed at Atlas Comics, and he was writing and art directing and doing a lot of things. He was wearing a lot of hats, but he did not enjoy the popularity then that he certainly has today. Stan Lee gave a shot at bringing back the Human Torch, bringing back Captain America as Commie Smasher Captain America, bringing back the Submariner, and the stories took a shift away from the World War II, let's fight the Nazis, into the Cold War. The Cold War changed a lot of storytelling sensibilities. A lot of characters have moved away from the magic-based and supernatural themes into an earlier sort of science base. The Silver Age of comics, which again has the biggest part of its life in the Cold War, was also dominated by science fiction themed stories that latched on to the American consciousness with its fear of little green men invaders from Mars. We also had the science fiction themed giant monsters that Godzilla in 1954 had made popular. Predecessor to Godzilla was the creature, the Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, and of course predecessor to that in 1933 was King Kong from RKO. We would see these giant monsters illustrated largely by Jack Kirby, but Jack Kirby was by no stretch of the imagination the only artist drawing these things. There was a lot of artwork from other popular artists. We recognize today Steve Ditko for something like Spider-Man or Doctor Strange. Steve Ditko was drawing more horror-themed science fiction stories in the early days of the Silver Age for Atlas Comics, again, Timely, Atlas, and they would become Marvel. This shift in storytelling sensibilities and this return to popularity for superheroes did not actually catch on for Captain America, the Torch, and Namor, and almost as quickly as they were brought back, they went away again. But it was not the end for Timely Comics. Now, running parallel to this time period is a huge surge of interest in romance comics. Teen humor comics like Archie, Pep, Jughead, Betty and Veronica, etc. These things were quite popular, but so too was Patsy Walker, A Date with Patsy, Patsy's friend Hetty. You may be currently reading Patsy Walker Hellcat. Well, Patsy Walker's origins go back into the 1950s in the early Silver Age of comics. So just know that when you're going, wow, she's been around for a long time. Romance comics. I don't even know where to begin here. The stories of boy meets girl and some very quick romantic interludes, some wholesome themed kind of boy meets girl, boy kisses girl, complication comes up, boy and girl break up, boy and girl get back together by the end. There was everything from young love, young bride, true teen confessions, and so on. Stan Lee wrote some of these things. Also, some of these things were drawn by John Romita. You'll know John Romita much later in the Silver Age of comics for doing The Amazing Spider-Man. John Romita was the artist that succeeded Steve Ditko. John Romita gave us really the best looking Gwen Stacy and Mary Jane, and one of the reasons for this is because he honed his craft in romance comics, and as Stan Lee said, he was really good at drawing pretty girls. So that carried over. That was a huge thing in the Silver Age, and romance comics didn't really lose their popularity until the succeeding Bronze Age. Now, as I move forward into the Silver Age, remember I said Timely, Atlas didn't really catch on with their superheroes. That doesn't happen until 1961 when Stan Lee gives us the Fantastic Four. Now, there's debate about who created what first. Was it Jack Kirby's contribution? Was it Stan Lee's contribution? Was it the fusion of the two together in collaboration? These are questions that I don't actually have answers to because I wasn't there. But what I do know is this. These four characters, this dysfunctional family of superheroes, caught on in a major way. It took a little bit of time for the sales numbers to really skyrocket, but it was evident that this book was popular and it was selling, and Stan Lee had a hit on his hands, and he was given some impulsion to follow up on that. So, at this point, Atlas Comics is slowly morphing into Marvel Comics, and this is where we get, from the Fantastic Four, the Incredible Hulk. In the pages of Journey into Mystery, we see the first appearance of Thor. In the pages of Tales of Suspense, we see Iron Man. Many of these books had been science fiction themed and horror themed monster stories, but as Stan Lee needed a place to put these popular superhero characters, he began to change the internal content from science fiction and horror themed into superhero themed books until such a time as these characters could take on books of their own. Now, DC Comics was not to be inconsidered at this point in time. Not only had DC given us The Flash and Green Lantern, but they had brought back the Atom. They had given us a new science fiction themed Hawkman, an alien policeman from the planet Thanagar, as opposed to the reincarnated Egyptian prince. So again, in this Silver Age, you see a shift in story content, in story direction, in character origins, and these things are indicative of the Silver Age of comics. The Silver Age was a great time, especially for Marvel, because their popularity was just growing exponentially. DC was floundering a little bit. They had some concepts, they had some good stories, they had good artists, they had good writers, but they weren't capturing the same degree of market share that Marvel Comics was at the time. They threw out a lot of strange ideas, a lot of strange concepts, like Buddy Baker, Animal Man, and Adam Strange in the pages of Mystery in Space. They gave us Metamorpho, the Element Freak. They gave us the Metal Men, and a great many other things. Well, not all of these ideas caught on and stuck, but a great many of these ideas would persist and be brought back at a later point in time. We saw also companies like Charlton Comics, Gold Key Comics, these were our alternatives, our independents. We had the kid-friendly things from Harvey Comics, and Archie, of course, was still carrying on. Disney's books had been published by Dell and then were later published by Gold Key, and that takes us through the Silver Age. Now, I'm going to back up a second here because a very important thing that came out of the Silver Age in terms of comics was also the Comics Code Authority. Comics came on trial at a dark point in time for them. The trial was really about whether comics promoted juvenile delinquency, whether comics could be blamed for a rise in youth crime and illiteracy and other such. Well, comic book publishers devised their own internal policing, if you will, their own rating system. They devised the Comic Code, and the Comic Code would determine what sort of content could go into these books. The comic code had a lot to do with shifting popularity away from horror comics and crime comics because some of the more lurid and mature themes could not be showcased anymore. The Comics Code Authority changed the presentation of monster stories, and it necessitated that monsters have a sort of a literary precursor. You could do a story about Dracula because there was a literary book about Dracula, but you couldn't do stories about zombies because, well, they weren't from literature, they weren't from books. Marvel managed to pick up things like Tomb of Dracula and Frankenstein's monster, and others as time went on, because we would periodically have to revisit the comic code and figure out what worked and what didn't work.